and welcome to a new episode of Minds Between Languages. Today is with us Agnieszka Chmiel, who will share with us her expertise on visual input in interpreting.
Hi, Agnieszka. Nice to meet you. Good to have you on Minds Between Languages.
Hello, thank you very much for having me.
When we talk about interpreting, usually we think about speaking and listening, but there's also the visual modality that you have been particularly interested in. What do interpreters actually see?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because usually when you think about interpreting as compared to translation, you might think, oh, this is in the auditory modality only, right? You just listen to the words and you interpret those words. You have nothing to do with the visuals. But this is not true, right? Actually, interpreters look at many things and see many things, and many things might be helpful to them, right? So first, you might think about all the visual input that interpreters are exposed to as either image-based or text-based, right? And when it comes to image-based, interpreters would first of all see the speaker, right? Most of the time, because sometimes you cannot see the speaker, and this is very troublesome to interpreters, but usually you would see the speaker, you would see the facial expressions, you would see gestures, you would see body posture, and all this gives you information, additional information that might be useful, especially when it comes to facial expressions, for instance. And then you also see the audience, right? And sometimes it might be useful as well, because the audience is reacting to the speaker, obviously. And the audience will include usually people who can understand the speaker and who cannot understand the speaker. And you, as the interpreter, obviously have to match the reactions of the original audience to the target audience of your interpretation. So that's quite important as well. Then you also see pictures that might be included on the slides the speaker is showing. You might see some graphics. You might see some videos that are shown by the speaker, or you might also see some props that the speaker is using, right? Sometimes people would bring some objects to show to the audience. So this is all image-based, right? And then quite a lot already, right? And then you have text-based stimuli or visual input. Some of them are provided by the speaker, and some of them are produced by the interpreter or interpreters themselves, right? So the speaker might have some notes or might have a script of the text, and the speaker might be gracious enough to provide interpreters with the text as well beforehand or right before the interpretation. Presentation slides, that's another source of both image-based and text-based input, and then some notes that will be used just by the speaker and probably won't be shared with interpreters. And then interpreters, if you look at interpreters in the booth, they might have their laptops in front of them, but also a lot of paper lying around, right? So these might be things like the agenda of the conference, where you have very important information such as names of presenters or titles of presentations, bio notes of speakers that might be read out by the host or the moderator of the meeting, and then some notes that interpreters themselves use, like when they write down names or numbers, either for themselves or for the boothmate that is active. They might have glossaries. All of these might be either paper-based or screen-based, used on their laptops. They might have some dictionaries open, various websites. So there's quite a lot to look at, actually.
There is indeed quite a lot of, let's say, sources of information or visual input that you have just mentioned. Are there actually some of these sources of visual input that are more important, more helpful than others, some maybe less important? Is there a difference?
Yes, yes. I would say that now speaking with my interpreter's hat on, the most important would be the list of names of either participants of the meeting or speakers or special guests that will be welcomed by the host. So a list of names with titles, with company positions, with names of organizations these people represent. So quite a lot of information that's very non-contextual, which means that you cannot infer those from the context, right? You have to, it's best to have those names and names of organizations written down somewhere so that you can use those for support, right? And think about all those special guests that have been invited to a meeting and are welcomed in a specific order by the host, right? If you mispronounce the name, or if you change the name of the organization, or if you make the president or the CEO just a representative, people might not be that happy about it, right? So I think the list of participants or the list of speakers names, that would be the most important thing. Next come slides which are information heavy, so it's graphs with numbers that might be a nightmare, especially when there are a lot of them. And things that would be for decoration only. So images that are just there to look at, but they do not really have any information. They don't really carry any information. These would be the least supportive, I would say. So we have the two extremes, right? The most important ones and the least important ones.
So some that contain a lot of information, also very important because it contains non-contextual information. And then on the other hand, or on the other extreme, there's some source of visual information that actually do not really contain information. So sources of visual input rather than visual information in that case.
Yes.
And now, with all these different types of visual input, I could imagine that some are a little bit harder to process for interpreters online, because as I understand, they're listening, speaking already, then they need to process at the same time all this visual information. Some may be easier to process. I mean, do you see, maybe also in your research, a difference between, let's say, different types of visual input?
Yes, definitely. If you have input within the same modality or of the same type, this input will be more difficult to process because you have the same kind of system in your mind that is processing it, right? So if you have textual information in an auditory form, right? So you have a speaker speaking, delivering a speech, and then you have a transcript of that speech verbatim. That will be definitely more difficult to process than the auditory speech and a slide that would have information in an image-based form. So let's say a graph, right? So that will be much easier because you're dealing with the text in an auditory form and information that comes from an image, from a graph, that it's much easier to grasp than just reading the notes or just reading the transcript, right? So, and if you think about it, it makes sense, right? That we have some models or some theories that actually tell us that if you're using the same modality, then there will be more interference, as in Zaber's cognitive load model, and it will be more difficult to process those, right? So if you ask me whether it's useful to have a text or transcript of a speech when interpreting, I would say yes and no, right? And it's It's not a very good answer. I understand, but first of all, it'll depend on the person, right? There are some interpreters who will use the text very much, and some that will just close their eyes and they won't look at the text because it will be too disturbing. They just want to focus on one modality only. But there will be interpreters who will use the text, but not word for word. They will just look for numbers or for names, so more salient, more visually salient information that they can use. And in this sense, it might be facilitatory, right? I think if you ask interpreters, do they want to have a transcript or not, they will all say yes, but whether they will use it and to what extent they will use it, that'll differ.
I mean, it helps them also to just prepare the content, right? I mean, to
Yes,
have this
definitely.
whole management of knowledge and all this preparation. I could also imagine that there are situations, right? The speaker has an accent,
Yes.
and in that case, the transcript might be more useful than in another case where the speaker speaks perfect, let's say British English or something like that.
Yes, definitely, right? So, for instance, in one of our studies where we focused on simultaneous interpreting with text, we really wanted the interpreters to use the text, right? Because we wanted to have the data. And some of them would really close their eyes and not look at the text. So what we did was, and this was deliberate, we used a non-standard English accent, as you mentioned, right? Accents are one of the reasons, or heavy accents or non-standard accents are one of the reasons interpreters might use textual information for support. So we used a non-standard accent so that our participants are more inclined to use the visuals, and they actually did. So it does help, as you said.
What did they tell you afterwards in this study? I mean, did they find it helpful, the transcript? Did they give some kind of feedback?
Well, the study was kind of nasty because what we were interested in was how they look at the text, but also how they deal with incongruent information, right? So what usually happens when you get a transcript from the speaker is that the speaker won't really read the transcript word for word, right? People would deviate from the transcript. They would sometimes add things, they would leave out things. So if you're really following the text, the written text very closely, you might be misled because I think there's some research, I don't remember the numbers correctly, that actually tells you how often, on average, speakers would deviate from a written text when delivering a speech, and that's quite frequent. So what we did in that study was we manipulated the visual input, right? So the auditory input was the same all the time, but the interpreters saw the text with some changes. And the changes were nasty because they were either in the numbers, right? So the numbers that they saw were not the ones that they heard, or the names, people's names or place names. So the most difficult bits that interpreters would usually look at for support when they have textual input. And so half of maybe not half, 1/3 was incongruent, so it was different from the auditory input, but most of them were correct. And of course, we didn't tell them that this is what we manipulated. So we told them, okay, this is the text, the speaker will deliver the text, and the accent is non-standard, so please, you can use the text to interpret. And what they did was they used the text very much, right? So they looked at the numbers and the names, and very frequently they used the wrong input, right? Because obviously when you interpret the auditor, what the speaker says takes precedence, right? This is the most important thing. This is what you should interpret, not what you have in the transcript. So they there was over reliance on the visual input, which was due to many reasons, right? Because of the cognitive overload or the difficulty of the speech or the speed, they relied on the visuals more. And when we talked to them later on, they either said, oh, I didn't notice, at times they didn't notice that there were differences, but most of them said, yeah, there was something wrong with the text, right? But I didn't remember what I heard, so I just used the visual modality, right? And these were professionals, right? These were professionals, but they still over relied on the visual modality, which is generally very strong. And we know from other studies of the so-called Calavita effect, where if you have visual input and auditory input, usually the visual input would take precedence. And this is what we found, right? Which means that interpreters have to or should be really careful when using visual stimuli, because the visual input, textual input might lead them astray.
So you need to be extra vigilant, actually. As soon as you have text material, kind of a speech manuscript, and you hear a number, you hear a name, in a way you should be extra vigilant to make sure it's really that name, it's really that number, it's really...
Yes. Yes. So in a sense, it's more difficult because you have three streams of information, right? Usually in simultaneous interpreting, you have just two, right? The speaker and yourself, right? Because you have to monitor yourself. And in simultaneous interpreting with text or with automatic subtitles, which is also, or automatic transcript, which is now the case in remote interpreting, you have the third stream or the third concurrent channel of information that you somehow have to coordinate. So there's more on your plate, right? You would think, okay, you have all the information there, you don't have to process the numbers, you don't have to remember, but at the same time, you do have to use some of your cognitive resources to coordinate another channel of information.
Now you mentioned two words that I would like to get back to. One is cognitive overload. You mentioned cognitive overload. What is it? How do you notice? What happens?
Yeah, so this is where you just have too much input, right? And interpreters, if this is, I've noticed when, collecting data from various interpreters over the years, that this is very individual, right? That some interpreters would want to avoid this overload, cognitive overload, and they would just close their eyes and focus on the auditory input only. Some interpreters would use both, but sometimes would be led astray, as I mentioned, and some, and I think this is the majority, would sometimes focus just on the auditory modality, sometimes look at the text. So that would vary depending on the text. If there are a lot of numbers or names, they would look more at the text. But if the text is quite easy, without it's not information dense, it's quite easy in terms of the accent or the the speed, then they would not use the text, right? And we also, in one of the studies where we used, again, simultaneous interpreting with text, we compared professionals to trainees, and we saw that trainees would look away more than interpreters to avoid interference, for instance, right? So if you have a sentence that you need to reformulate, you cannot really follow the sentence in a linear order. Especially untrained interpreters would look away and would just focus on the auditory modality so that they do not have this interference from the visual form. So that's another thing.
Now, I could imagine that you could also alleviate your cognitive load on the textual level. Let's say if I have a speech that is syntactically very complex, I could make easier sentences, let's put it like that.
Mhm.
And then maybe that would free capacities to follow the speech manuscript. Would that also be an option? Is it something you can observe in your research, or?
Yes, I think that there's a big difference whether you have the transcript, the script available before interpreting or just when interpreting, right? I never actually manipulated that, but I know there are studies that would give the text to interpreters before the experiment to see how they prepare. And there's a lot going on that on that text, definitely, right? Interpreters would underline the most difficult information. So, for instance, names, numbers, terminology. But that's pretty obvious. The more interesting thing is that some interpreters would divide sentences into shorter ones, right? So there would be a lot of slashes in the sentences. So they have shorter bits that they can process more easily. So there's a lot of scribbling. If you give a text to the interpreter in a paper form before the like shortly a few minutes before the interpretation, there will be a lot going on there, right? A lot of pre-processing of the text before they use it as visual input.
Yeah, fascinating. And then the other word that you mentioned is remote interpreting.
Mhm.
Could
Yeah.
you just maybe say a couple of words on remote interpreting? What changes in remote interpreting?
Yeah.
Maybe also what's kind of the setting that
Mhm.
interpreters have in this
Yeah, this is
online
really
world?
fascinating because on top of all the visual sources of information that I mentioned before, we have additional ones, right? Basically, what happens in remote interpreting is that the visual input is becoming more complex because first, interpreters might work with various devices or various screens. Right? So they might have the speaker and the slides on Zoom or any other platform on one screen. They might have a virtual booth on another screen. A virtual booth is where they would see the boothmate or where they would communicate with the boothmate via a muted video call or via chat. So there's another source of visual information. They might use an option of an automatic transcript that many online platform offer right now. So they see the script live and they might use it. Again, this might be imperfect. They might use it as an additional source of visual input. Then there's more input produced by the participants of the meeting themselves, right? Because there's a Q&A and a Q&A box, for instance, that might be used throughout the speech. So you might have questions, written questions popping up during the presentation, and the speaker might refer to them or might not. This might be during the presentation or during a Q&A session. So again, you have something more going on. You might have a live chat where participants react to what is happening as well. And somehow you have to monitor that as well because it might give you some additional information. So definitely there's more, right? And how do interpreters cope with all that? We conducted actually 2 studies on remote interpreting, which I find fascinating when it comes to studying cognitive load and studying processing as done by interpreters. In one study with Tianyun Lee, we looked at automatic subtitles, so automatic transcript that might be generated, and how this influences processing. And we thought that if there is automatic transcript, the accuracy will be higher, obviously, but also the cognitive load will be higher, right? Because there's another channel. What we found was that the accuracy was much higher, definitely, but cognitive load was lower. right? The data was not that clean, was not that consistent because we also manipulated the accuracy of the transcript, of the subtitles. But in general, what we found was that they helped a lot, right? Both in terms of accuracy, but also in terms of cognitive load. It was easier for interpreters to process this particular speech. But in this study, we used a very difficult speech with a lot of information, with a very heavy accent, a non-European English accent, and the context was very difficult for interpreters, and the speed was pretty, probably not uncomfortable, but pretty demanding, right? So if you have that many factors influencing the difficulty of the speech, the automatic transcript, even though it might not be perfect, might be useful. And then we conducted another study where we looked at how interpreters process all of those windows that you have present on your screen when interpreting remotely. And an interesting fact was that even though they have to process so much, interpreters would also look at themselves, right? We had one condition with a virtual booth where the interpreters would see both the boothmate and themselves. And actually, what would be your guess? What's the percentage of time they kept looking at themselves?
I don't know, based on the observation of myself,
Mhm.
probably something like 70%.
No, actually it was about 5 or 6%, right? Because they
Oh
were
no,
looking
that's
at the
nothing.
slides, they were looking at the speaker, but still, amidst, all the visual input that they had to process, they still had time to look at themselves, right? We don't know the reasons. You might look at yourself for various reasons, but they did, right? So it was quite interesting, but that was a byproduct of the study. Generally, we found that they were very successful in navigating a very complex visual environment, and they did a good job, right? When there was a written question that appeared in a chat box, they obviously looked at the text and they used a bit of simultaneous interpreting with text. When the question was read out by the host. When there were slides, they were looking at the slides. They kept looking at the speaker as well. So and they kept looking at the prompts provided by the boothmate as well. So although it was very complex visually, they were very proficient, or they were very successful in navigating this environment.
Mhm. And did they already have experience with, online conferences?
Yes, we did. We collected the study after the pandemic, so I
Yeah.
think they had much more exposure to interpreting. I think we had one participant who said, "Yes, I do remote interpreting, but I always do it with my boothmate present, sitting next to me, right? A co-located boothmate." So. Working with a virtual boothmate or with a boothmate that was non-collocated was something new, but that was just one person out of I think altogether we had like 35, right? Because that was the AIC funded study that we did both in Poland and in Italy. So we had two language combinations. But in general, they were used to working remotely, and of course, some of them were happy. Some of them were not happy with that. But I think it's now part and parcel of interpreting practice.
So now that we are talking about the future of interpreting, are there any developments that you're looking forward to? Others that
Mhm.
maybe you're dreading?
Yeah, so people definitely some people are worried about the future of interpreting because of AI developments. I think there will be um, fewer and fewer interpreters needed in the future for the premium market only. I think that would be my guess. But before that happens, I think there are very exciting times for researchers because there are many interesting things that we might research. First of all, how interpreters, human interpreters, collaborate with machine interpreting, right? There are all sorts of solutions that are being tested right now. So that's one thing. Another thing is how human interpreters use technology to their advantage. So, or artificial AI assistants that would give you prompts and translation equivalents of those terms or names as well. So that's another thing that's worth investigating. And my PhD student actually is working on that right now. But another interesting area is how delegates, so how participants or users of interpreting services react to AI based interpreting, right, or machine interpreting. And I think this is something that will definitely be on my research agenda in the near future.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Agnieszka. It was a very interesting interview. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Anne-Catherine. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.